Leading mobile-first communication in global online higher education. I want you to imagine yourself attending a university class using only a smartphone, limited data, with an unstable internet connection. For millions of students around the world, this situation isn't hypothetical, it is their daily reality. Yet many students around the universities design online courses assuming that students have laptops, reliable broadband, and access to platforms like Zoom. When those assumptions don't match the student's technological realities, an important equity question begins to emerge. This reality highlights an important shift happening in global online learning environments. In global higher education, an important shift is taking place in how students access digital learning environments. In many regions, students rely primarily on smartphones rather than laptops to participate in their courses. At the same time, mobile data can be expensive and reliable broadband access is not always available. Despite these realities, many universities still design online courses around platforms like Zoom and traditional learning management systems. As a result, students often turn to messaging platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, or Signal to communicate with their classmates and get support in their learning. Research on mobile learning environments shows that these mobile first communications practices are becoming increasingly common in a global educational context. When institutional platforms do not align with students' technological realities, an equity gap begins to emerge. This presentation explores how educational technology leaders can respond to the emerging trend. The shift towards mobile-first communication is not simply a temporary response to online learning during COVID. Instead, research suggests it represents a larger structural change in digital communication. Globally, mobile device ownership now exceeds laptop ownership, and messaging applications have become the preferred way that people communicate digitally. Researchers such as Kukulska-Hume and Traxler describe mobile learning as an increasingly important part of an educational access in developing regions. But they also note that these boundaries between formal and informal learning spaces are beginning to blur. Students already using messaging platforms to ask questions, collaborate with their peers, and share resources. In other words, mobile communication ecosystems are already shaping how learning happens. These developments reveal an important contrast between two different digital learning environments. For many global learners, internet access occurs primarily through smartphones. Their bandwidth is limited, and data costs influence how students communicate online. Messaging apps like WhatsApp have become the cultural norm for digital interaction. In contrast, students in the United States often learn in environmental supports by broadband internet, laptops, and institutional platforms such as Zoom and LMSs or learning management systems. Both groups may be enrolled in the very same university, but they experience the digital learning environment very differently. This creates a leadership tension, one institution, but two technological realities. Educational technology leaders must consider how communication systems can support both contexts. Research on messaging platforms in higher education provides several important insights. Multiple studies show that messaging tools such as WhatsApp can support academic collaboration and communication among students. For example, research conducted in a Malaysian university found that students reported improved teamwork, communication efficiency, and coordination when using WhatsApp for the academic work. Similarly, a case study from the University of Bahrain found that WhatsApp supported collaborative discussions and helped students exchange course information more quickly than during their studies. Other research examining communication patterns between instructors and students found that the messaging platforms, often used alongside their coursework, instructors may use them to send reminders, answer questions, and maintain communication outside the scheduled class time. Together, these studies suggest that messaging platforms can provide valuable support for communication and collaboration in a digital learning environment. However, because these tools are often exist outside of the learning institution, they also raise some important questions for educational leaders about governance, communication boundaries, and long-term sustainability. At first glance, this issue might appear to be a debate about tools. For example, whether or not universities should use platforms such as Zoom or messaging apps like WhatsApp. But the real challenge is much broader than just choosing between technologies. Instead, this is a system design challenge. Educational technology leaders must think about how communication infrastructures support accessibility, governance, and institutional accountability. Rather than focusing on a single tool, leaders must design communication ecosystems that allow multiple platforms to work together while maintaining institutional standards. In other words, the goal is not to replace institutional systems, but to design them in ways that expand access while protecting both students and faculty. When we compare common communication platforms, we can see that each tool is optimized for different purposes. Zoom, for example, supports institutional control and structured synchronous communication. However, it also requires a higher bandwidth and stable internet access. Messaging platforms such as WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal require far less data and are widely accessible worldwide. However, these platforms often lack institutional features such as academic archiving, formal record keeping, or administrative oversight. Because each platform supports different needs, relying on a single communication tool may not be effectively serve a diverse student population. So this reinforces the idea that communication systems should be designed as integrated ecosystems rather than isolated tools. One possible approach is to develop a hybrid communication model that balances accessibility and institutional governance. In this model, the learning management system, such as Canvas, still remains the official academic record. This will deal with assignments, grades, feedback, and compliance documentation to remain within the institutional system. Zoom could be and can continue to be used to support structured synchronous instruction when the bandwidth allows. Messaging platforms, such as WhatsApp, can then function as an equity companion with their things. These spaces can support discussions, clarification, peer collaboration, as well as community building. However, successful integration requires to have some clear guardrails. Grades should never be shared in messaging apps. Faculty communication hours should be defined. Codes of conduct and accessibility reviews should definitely be implemented. And data governance policies should also guide their platform use. Equity requires structure, not informal adoption. For institutions considering this approach, a phased governance plan can help ensure a responsible implementation. During the first year, universities could begin with a small pilot program in selected programs. Next, institutions should conduct a data privacy that impact assessment and accessibility audits to ensure that there's compliance with regulations and inclusive learning standards. Faculty training models would help instructors understand how to use hybrid communication systems effectively while maintaining their professional boundaries. Clear communication policies and digital citizenship education for students would also support responsible platform use. Finally, institutions should evaluate outcomes using metrics such as student engagement, retention, and satisfaction. Using these measures helps leaders assess system quality and sustainability over time. The rise of mobile-first communication ecosystems is already reshaping how students learn and interact online. Research on mobile learning and messaging platform shows that students are increasingly using these tools to communicate and find support beyond their formal course platforms. In many cases, students are not waiting for institutions to redesign their systems. They're already creating their own communication networks to ask questions, coordinate group work, and stay connected with our classmates. The challenge for educational technology leaders is not whether these tools exist, but how the institutions are responding to them. Ignoring them can create barriers to access, while allowing them without structure can introduce risks to privacy, governance, and faculty work overload. Effective leadership requires intentional system design. Educational technology leaders must move towards reacting to student platform choices towards designing a hybrid communication ecosystem that balances accessibility, governance, and sustainability. Ultimately, equity in digital learning does not happen automatically. It happens when leaders design systems that expand access while protecting the integrity of the learning environment. Equity requires both access and accessibility, and achieving balance that requires both intentional leadership. Studies used for this presentation can be found here. Have a good day.